No comment.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with the decision, to be clear. I thought Tyson won the fight pretty handily. I gave round 3 to Jones. One judge had round 6 scored 10-10, which I kind of liked because they both actually had some good moments in that round. And then I didn't really see anything in round 8 that let me know which way to score it. But I thought every other round Tyson won quite handily, and that's 5 rounds. So even if you give all 3 rounds I just outlined to Jones, I still don't see how he gets the scorecard. As a side note to that, as someone who's newer to boxing, I found it kind of nice to be trying to score 2-minute rounds instead of 3-minute rounds. It's just a little easier to know. Let's keep going from there, though, and talk about the fight. For what it was, 2 guys in their 50s, which just is going to have a lot of question marks in a sparring match. I mean, you see prime UFC heavyweights who look a lot worse than they did. Both guys had power, and both guys wanted to fight. They didn't just want to stand tentatively and look at each other and feint at the air. I mean, that you might have to give most of the credit for that to Mike Tyson, because he came out trying to take Roy Jones's head off. But you've got to give a lot of credit to Roy Jones too, because he worked with what he had and managed to not get his head taken off. And I was skeptical about his ability to do that because I didn't think what he does best, footwork, head movement, and crazy speed, would be enough to not let Tyson take his head off for 8 rounds. And I was sort of right about that, but I was sort of wrong. So I was sort of right because it wasn't 8 rounds of Roy Jones doing that. But I was sort of wrong because it was 8 rounds of Roy Jones mixing up his specialty with a lot of smart clinch work to slow Tyson down and save himself. And part of that was a consequence of the ring being a bit smaller, which they said was to bring more action, but I think it had the opposite effect. If you had had a bigger ring, Roy Jones would have had more room to maneuver, which I think would have made the fight more interesting. So I was a bit disappointed about that. Then the other obvious difference was that the rounds were a minute shorter. Aside from letting me have an easier time trying to score them, I think that was in Jones's favor because the man was gassed. And that might have been a strategy he had going in, like, hey, I might not be able to hold on to him forever, but I can hold on to him for 16 minutes. So I think the shorter rounds favored Roy Jones and the shorter ring helped him get the clinch, and it might have stopped him from letting his ego reign free and try and duck and dodge a bit more free, which would have made it more interesting. But as a Tyson fan, when I say more interesting, I kind of mean giving Tyson a better chance to take his head off. But my overall takeaway was just, it was really fun. I had a lot of fun watching it. Like, they both came to fight, and it was great.
So we had a bit of debate about who we thought would be, or at least we debated Mike Tyson's endurance for this fight. And I kind of pointed out that he hadn't fought in 15 years, but you're saying that he was moving better than Roy Jones was in the fight?
Well, first, just to be clear, he's the bigger man. Like, Roy Jones walks around at heavyweight now, but in his prime, he was several divisions lower than Tyson. So especially with a guy as fierce as Tyson, just it's the advantage to him as the bigger guy. So when I say he was moving around, I mean his mass times acceleration generated more force than Roy Jones could.
Oh, man.
So he was walking him forward. He was throwing the harder shots. He was forcing Roy Jones to react to him. And overall, Jones did a pretty good job of reacting by forcing the clinch anytime he was in danger and using his footwork and head movement when he could. I think it was the 5th round. He had this beautiful, like, duck underhook, step outside of a wild uppercut Tyson threw. 1 or 2 no-look jabs, which were just sexy. Yeah, it was... Tyson came in great. I was wondering, what's Mike Tyson going to look like? And I won't say he exceeded my expectations, but he definitely met them. And I had pretty high expectations. So, I mean, credit to both fighters. It was really awesome. And it wasn't just the fight that was awesome. And that's why I want to circle out to a little.
So then, do you think that, so this kind of kicks off Tyson's grand plan to create this whole Legends League. Do you think that this fight showed people that there's a potential for something like that, where you have those like 70-year-old golfers, the 50-year-old boxers, the 3-on-3 league of 50-year-old basketball players? Do you think there's a market for that, or is it just kind of that boxing hype is greater because that aligns with our parents' generation and that's what they grew up watching?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. I don't see a league in the traditional sense where it's continuous games over a season. What I can see is spectacles, huge events, and the success of such a league is going to be dependent on each event and the hype it generated. So, as a premier kickoff event, this really couldn't have gone that much better. And the main reason that is because Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. both showed up and both they came to win in the ring. So you can keep booking these events, but every event is going to be its own thing, and it's going to be the aggregate of what's produced at each event. So I think if you want to be successful, you have to be very carefully selective about who you let in and what kind of performance you can expect.
Nice.
The other thing is what I really enjoyed about this is that, yeah, Tyson hopes to spring off more from this, but this was a single event. And the goal wasn't really to make money because they knew Tyson's name would draw enough money in. So they didn't have to cover the ring with sponsors. They didn't have to constantly be putting plugs in between. One of my favorite things about the event was in between fights, they weren't just like mixing between plugging advertisements and plugging their next event, plugging their own product. Like when you watch a UFC or a boxing card, time is a resource and they're very aware of that. So in between fights, they're trying to get the most money out of time, either by making money on advertisements or trying to sell people on what's next. And that's good business. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to just knock that and say that's horrible. I don't want that in the product. But there was a freedom they had in not really having to sell what's next and knowing that they were going to be financially secure in this. And I really enjoyed that. If my first biggest shout out of the night goes to Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr., my second biggest shout out of the night has to go to Snoop Dogg. The man fucking entertained. He went from calling fights to getting off his ass, putting on like a 15-minute performance, which my dad and I were just cracking up watching, and then getting right back behind the desk to call fights. And let's be real, he did it with like enough THC in his system to put both of us to sleep. So, man, I loved listening to Snoop call the fights. He entertained me performing, and I'm not even a rap fan. I'm going to take this moment to put out an open invitation to Snoop to be on this podcast anytime. It's now on my bucket list to sit down and watch literally any sporting event with him. I don't care if it's basketball, hockey, football, boxing, MMA. Huge shout to Snoop Dogg. That was really fun. And so circle back to you asking about what could we see next. I really hope they keep it loose. They keep it free. They had a panel with a play-by-play caller, Sugar Ray Robinson, boxing legend, Israel Adesanya, MMA current legend in the making, and Snoop Dogg. And you don't get that in, like, ESPN can't put that on their card. UFC can't put that on their card. The NBA can't do that sort of thing. Whereas this free, loose, undefined event, you can do that. So if they're going to move forward with this, I really hope to see more of that. But financially speaking, I don't see how they follow this up with anything bigger.
Yeah. I agree with that. And the kind of space that I see this in is very similar to what you're saying. And to build off of this, like, they can't have a league with all these legends playing because it's just not going to be sustainable. But they can live in this space where they have those legends that have that nostalgia factor that bring in our parents' generation. and then how they're going to draw in enough audience from our market is they're going to include things like Snoop Dogg. They're going to include performances from Lil Wayne, who actually didn't perform, but he was going to. They're going to include YG, who actually was terrible, and we don't need to talk about that. They can have the style bender commentating, and then they can, in the undercard or as part of the card, they can have these extremely notorious, or I don't want to say popular because popular is not the right word, but when you have a YouTube influencer fighting an NBA player in your card, that's going to bring in Generation Z. And that's how you can draw that younger generation into watching some of these events. It's not, you're going to get the older demographic because they want to watch Mike Tyson fight, but that's how you're going to draw in some of these younger eyeballs. And that kind of leads us into Jake Paul and Nate Robinson, which...
Yeah, I don't really want to talk about it, but we do got to talk about it. Two things I want to check you on just before we do talk about it. First, I actually got one text from my buddy who was like, hey, how can I watch this Mike Tyson fight? So I think Mike Tyson does have an appeal to our generation and former legends. Like, if you can find a way to get like Jordan on a court in some grand spectacle thing, I think our generation is going to tune in to watch it, even though we didn't get to grow up with Jordan. You could say the same about like Gretzky, or I don't want to undersell the past legends' ability to attract our generation.
I agree, but it's one thing to kind of attract the sport enthusiast, and it's another
Right.
to attract the general fan of entertainment, right?
I hear you. From a marketing perspective, for
Yeah.
sure, that's a demographic that if you want to succeed, it would be lucrative to tap into. All right, I guess I gotta talk about Nate Robinson, Jake Paul. The first 2.5 minutes to me looked like two bums rushing at each other. Just they stepped up, they ran at each other, both swung, awkwardly ended up in the clinch, and
It was a
had
cuddle
the
fest.
ref disengage them. And then they just did it again and again and again and again. And I was like, oh boy, this is more or less what I expect. And then, okay, gotta give some credit to Jake Paul, because 2.5 minutes of that bum rushing, and he figured out how to time Robinson. He found a nice right hook, I believe, and landed it right on Robinson's ear as Nate was stepping in, and it hurt Robinson, dropped him after he landed the first one. The round ended pretty well, and Nate being hurt made it that much easier to land the second one, which hurt Nate even more. And that made it that much easier to land the third one, which ended it. And that's the next thing I want to say, is it was really disappointing to watch the ref let Nate get up after that second knockdown. I mean, every 10 count I've ever seen, Nate Robinson didn't even pass the first one the first time he got knocked down. I think the ref understood that this was a spectacle and he wanted to let it go on a little more. And I kind of liked that he let Nate in after the first 10 count. The second one, the man was done. There was no need to let him get in there. He had no chance. He was hurt. He wasn't ready at the count of 10. He needed longer than that. So that was pretty hard to watch, because when the third punch landed, he was out and he was on the ground for a while. So disappointing from the ref. Let's talk about Jake Paul a little. He clearly has power. I didn't like that first 2.5 minutes. I was disappointed. It took him longer to figure it out, but I guess if you zoom back, he had 6 rounds to work, and he figured something out in the first round against a guy who really doesn't know how to box, but there's something there. So if he wants to show he's for real, I want to see him fight a guy who actually knows how to box. He can keep picking names. He can keep fighting guys who have never been in the ring before. But his post-fight interview, he was saying, I'm for real. In 10 years, he's comparing himself to Deontay Wilder. So if you want to be Deontay Wilder, who don't get me started on cherry picking with him, but you've at least got to fight some guys who have some wins over other actual boxers. So I'm a little impressed by Jake Paul's power, the fact that he was able to time that, but I'm going to hold it at that until he actually gets a win and shows something impressive over someone who can actually box.
Yeah, I don't have much to say on that. I can respect the fact that he's trying to build his brand, and he does that by being out there and being controversial and saying things that are going to get him in the media. But I mean, they're just annoying dudes, to be honest, him and his brother. And I don't want to see them if I can help it. And
Well, that's
yeah,
the marketing strategy, right? They piss you off and you want to see them get knocked out. You want to see them get hurt. And so you tune in. That doesn't work on you, but it works on a lot of people. Um, Actually, well, Jake Paul had 2 calls outs. One of them was so ludicrous, we don't need to talk about it. But the other one did kind of interest me. He called out Dillion Danis, who is related to Jake Paul's ludicrous call out, as he is his grappling coach. But Dillion Danis is a similar heel to the Paul brothers. Very annoying guy you really tune in because you want to see him get hurt, who is a jiu-jitsu specialist and is currently fighting in Bellator MMA. I believe he's 3-0 against absolute cans. So it's an interesting call out because you could tap into like what mixed martial arts was when it originally originated. You'd have a jiu-jitsu guy versus a boxing guy. And because Dillion Danis fights in Bellator, which we'll say is a little thirsty for views, they would be more likely to be interested in making that fight. And when Logan Paul did his second fight with KSI2, they did it through DAZN, which is connected to Bellator. So an MMA fight between Dillion Danis and Jake Paul does actually grab my interest. I would definitely tune in to see that. And I don't know if people are going to be talking about it, if it's realistic, but I think that would be a fun way to go.
all right. That's some great wrap up for you. And we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to see what else grabbed your attention on the weekend from UFC Vegas 15.